Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bouncing Back. I am your host, Joanna, and today we are going to be chatting about debt and specifically how we can optimize debt or reduce its burden. And joining me to chat about this topic today is Aaron Gilbert. Aaron is a professor of finance and head of Department of Economics and Finance at AUT in Auckland. Hi, Aaron. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, great to be here.
Yeah, of course. It's our pleasure. I'd love if you could start off by just telling us a bit more about who you are and what it is you do.
So, as you said, I'm a professor of finance. So I do research and teach in the area of household finance or personal finance, which is I'm finding really, really fascinating. And it's a lot about trying to find ways in which we can help people to make better financial decisions so that they become more financially resilient.
Yeah. And what inspired you to get into finance and especially household finance?
Household finance has been a relatively new sort of thing. I actually did my PhD way back when in law and finance, so looking at insider trading regulations. But more recently, I've sort of moved into this area because I've really enjoyed looking at this sort of area around how we build financial capability. So how do we make people more financially capable? And I guess the big thing that's driven me into that sort of area is when I look at the students who I'm teaching, increasingly they've got a harder road ahead of them in terms of financial mistakes are a lot more costly than they used to be. It's harder to get onto the property ladder, and financial mistakes are a lot more costly. So I guess I've sort of moved into that space as a way of trying to help find ways in which we can really help people to make better financial decisions.
Yeah. And you said that you do teach at a university, so you work with young people. So do you find that this is becoming an increasingly more important topic, especially with younger people and especially with their finances, how they manage it and how they set themselves up for their future?
I don't think they always necessarily realize how important it is, but
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a student myself, I feel like I don't even completely understand finance or understand how important it is until I'm at that point where I'm like, oh, maybe I do need to start managing my money a bit better. So hopefully we'll dive into this topic and get some advice and tips for people who are looking to better manage their finances as well. So before we do that, we have a section called Have You Met Aaron Gilbert? So here we just get to know you with a few fun questions. So my first one for you is, what is your favorite book?
Because I spend a lot of my days sort of reading on finance and finance topics, I actually tend to spend my off times reading sci-fi and urban fantasy. So I don't know that I would necessarily say I have a favorite book, but yeah, I tend to read those sorts of books.
Yeah, amazing. And is there something that you've recently read that you could drop a title of for us?
There's an author who I really like, Steve McHugh. He's a British author of an urban fantasy series that I've really enjoyed. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. And my next question for you is, what is a movie that you have recently enjoyed?
I recently rewatched The Martian and really enjoyed that. I think that's quite a cool movie.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of that one. When did that one come out?
Oh, probably going on close to 10 years ago. It's a Matt Damon movie.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yep.
Great. I've got a couple more questions here for you. So my next one is, are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
I have a not quite 3-year-old, so most of what I wind up listening to is The Wiggles and Cocomelon, unfortunately.
Oh, I love it. It's so cute. Well, hopefully you'll find some time when they're older to listen to some podcasts, or maybe they'll get into podcasts. So I love that. Great. And I've got one more here for you, which is, do you have a role model, or if they're not a role model, someone that you look up to, or even someone famous?
Not so much, to be honest. I think I aspire to be, I really like those people for whom, what's the way to describe it? They understand what their values are. And they understand, even when we're talking about finance and stuff like that, for everybody, money is not the be all and end all. They know what it is that they're about in life. So generally, I aspire to be that sort of person. Don't know that I always succeed, but
Yeah, I think that's a really great point you make, because I feel like the people that I look up to, or not even, I wouldn't call them my role models, but people I look at and I'm like, wow, you're really inspirational, is because they're so confident and set in their values, and they know what that looks like and how they can represent that to the best of their ability, and they really stick by it. So I find that always quite inspirational.
Yeah, there's certainly something about people who are authentic in that regard.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing those with us. I'd love if we could dive into the topic for today. So finance is a big topic. I know a lot of people don't actually stop to think about it or understand it. Like me personally, I feel like I'm such a novice when it comes to understanding finance and the lingo and everything surrounding it, basically. So if we could start off by defining what financial literacy is and what does it mean to understand finance and debt.
And that in itself is a bit of an interesting starting point. The literature used to use financial literacy a lot, but the language has actually developed, particularly over the last 10 years. And we're now sort of more focused on a concept called financial capability. So financial literacy is what you know. And so I guess about 20 years ago, there was a very strong belief that people weren't making good financial decisions. The best way to make them make better financial decisions was to give them more knowledge about finance. So we talked a lot about financial literacy and improving financial literacy. I think what we've come to realize over time is that it's a much more nuanced situation, and that there's a lot of other factors that impact on a person's financial decision making. And so, yes, we can improve a person's financial knowledge, but we also need to look at things like how confident they are in the decisions that they're making, and also their behaviors. And so that's where this concept of financial capability comes in. So when we talk about financial literacy, we're talking about that knowledge of really basic financial concepts. And to use some jargon, terms like compound interest, diversification. Do you understand how the economy works in terms of inflation, and even some of the basics around investing? So that's the sort of financial knowledge aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing though, a lot of people, they know the basics of finance, oh, you got to save and those types of things. But I feel like when it comes to understanding, like you mentioned, compound interest and diversification, I feel like people get lost there and they're like, oh, this is too confusing. So how does developing our understanding and knowledge as well improve our ability to, better manage our finances?
I think if you understand a concept like compound interest, then you start to understand the importance of the decisions that you're making. There's one of those fake quotes that that's apparently was said by Einstein, but really wasn't. But the point holds. Compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe. But the reality is that compound interest works on very long time horizons. So the decisions that a 20-year-old makes today about their retirement will bear fruit by the time that they hit retirement. But for most of us, we don't make those decisions until much closer to retirement age. And so we get less benefit from some of these concepts. So I think the big thing is, if you understand even a little bit about the concepts, you don't have to be able to do all the calculations and stuff like that. But if you know the concepts well enough, then it sort of gives you some idea of the importance of the decisions that you're making and what the consequences of those decisions are. And particularly when you're talking about a concept like diversification, it's a concept that on the face of it is very simple, but is actually a bit more nuanced. And so it is something that you sort of need to understand, because we have seen situations where people have thought that they were diversified and they weren't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do individuals go about, developing their literacy or knowledge surrounding these types of concepts?
And this is a really difficult thing that has been playing out globally. How do we make people more financially literate or financially capable? And so we've seen a lot of governments go down the route of financial education programs, and particularly embedding financial education into schools.
Yeah.
Some of the evidence on that has been not so promising. And particularly when we talk about debt use, what we've seen is that financial education programs in schools don't tend to work very effectively for debt behaviours. And that sort of makes sense when you think about it, because if you're teaching a 15-year-old about debt, but they can't take out debt until they're 18,
yeah,
I mean, they're not using that knowledge, they're going to forget it. How do adults acquire that knowledge? There are a huge number of resources that are out there. The internet is rife with people who will tell you how to become more financially capable. There are a lot of books. There are, just a huge range of resources. And the thing is, they're all largely singing from the same song sheet. So you don't have to worry too much about where your source is, as long as they're fairly sort of mainstream. And you can pick up a lot of really good tips and stuff like that. In Australia, for instance, the Barefoot Investor has got a lot of really good ideas and concepts that work really well, and work for a range of different personalities and people.
Yeah, I do know that book has been recommended by a lot of people. I feel like it circulates a lot in Australia as well. So that's a good one to hear. Talking about debt, I know people know what debt is, but how do people get into debt? I'm sure it's not as simple as they spend too much money.
In some cases, it is that simple. And I think it's interesting that you make the comment that we know what debt is. One of the things that I've been looking at recently is buy now, pay later. And at least in New Zealand, and I'm not sure if it's the same case in Australia, some of our buy now, pay later providers were very much pitching themselves as not being debt. And because of the way that the consumer finance laws were set up, legally they weren't categorized as debt or consumer finance. But they very much are. And so I think we're starting to see a bit of a blurring in our understanding of what is debt, or at least certain products are being pitched in a way that make them seem like they're perhaps not, which makes it harder for people again, because if debt is not debt,
Yeah.
how do I know to apply the knowledge that I have around debt? So, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. In terms of like buy now, pay later, I know personally when I use that, I don't really process that as being a form of debt because I'm like, okay, I'm paying for a little bit of it now, but I know I'm going to have to pay for it next week and the week after for 4 weeks. And it's pretty much already paid off in my mind. So how does that kind of work?
Yeah, and because it doesn't come with an interest rate, it has been designed to make us think that it is effectively sort of free. And we associate debt as being something that is expensive and it's costly and it costs more than if I paid for it. And buy now, pay later, if used wisely, is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is, as you said, the way we process it is a little bit different. So, for instance, we know that people will tend to spend more with buy now, pay later because because it costs me $100, but I only have to pay $25 today, so I can actually spend $100 today. So all of a sudden you've got $400 worth of debt or $300 worth of future debt coming at you. So it's a little bit tricky like that, and the way that it works on our brain is not necessarily always as conducive as it should be to us behaving well with it.
Yeah, and the concept of debt has this very negative connotation, you know, like you owe someone or an organization money. So do you think there's an idea as so-called like healthy debt or debt that isn't so bad?
There is this concept of good debt and bad debt.
Yeah.
And we often talk about consumer debt as being bad debt. And the reason for that is there's a couple of reasons for that. One, consumer debt tends to be very expensive, right? So if I'm taking out, say, a hire purchase, or if I'm using a credit card, the interest rates on those can be extremely high, you know, sort of 20, 25%. The other aspect of those is they are for goods that are going to depreciate in value. So by the time that I've paid out, if I get a laptop, I buy it on hire purchase over 36 months. By the time that I've paid it off, that laptop has actually got no value. And it has cost me more than if I had paid cash for it on the day. So it actually becomes quite an expensive purchase. Good debt, on the other hand, is debt that should improve our net worth. It should lead to us being more wealthy in the long run. So we often sort of think about 3 types of debt as being good debt. Debt for education, so student loans. Although I think most students wouldn't necessarily agree with that. Mortgages, because what we're buying is a house, and a house is generally an appreciating asset. And to some degree, business loans, because again, you're building an asset that in the long run should be worth more. Now, there's risk associated with that, but in the long run, it should improve your financial position, not worsen it the way that consumer debt does.
Yeah. And are there any mistakes that people make, like common mistakes when they're trying to reduce debt?
Yeah, quite a few.
Yeah.
One of the first ones I would say is, so if you're going to go about the process of reducing debt, the first thing that you need to do is make a plan as to how you're going to do it. And there are different approaches that get talked about for reducing debt. And the 2 main ones are labeled what they call the snowball method and the avalanche method. So the snowball method says you pick your smallest debt first, you pay that off. Then you take the next smallest debt and you pay that one off. And you keep working through the list until you've paid off all your debts. The avalanche method says you pick the most expensive debt first and you clear that one first. And then you move to the next most expensive and so on. In some cases, those will be the same. In other cases, they're not. The bit that people forget is the psychological component to it. The avalanche method, because you're paying off your most expensive debt, it can often seem like you're not making any progress because that's high interest. If you've only got a small amount extra to contribute to paying off that debt, it can seem like you're not making any real progress at all. And so over time, it can be quite demoralizing. And so people don't stick with the plan.
Yeah.
And they fall off that bandwagon. So although mathematically that's the better approach, for some people who need to see some sort of a sign that they're actually winning, to have some successes, the debt snowball method, where you pay off the smallest one first, psychologically gives you that sense of a win, and that's a motivating factor. And so it motivates you to do the next one and the next one. So what is the most efficient or the most cost-effective method may not actually be the most effective. And so what some of the research has found is that for some types of people, it's actually better to go with the smaller ones rather than the best method. The other thing that we know is that people will often overestimate their ability to actually pay down debt. So some of that can be from setting too strict a budget. So we set a budget, we don't give ourselves any real slack. Unfortunately, Murphy will rear his ugly head, and something will happen. And so you'll blow your budget. Or for other people, particularly those sorts of people who are perhaps a little more of the live now type, they will overestimate basically their commitment to paying that debt down. And so there was a research study done which shows that people made a plan of how much debt they were going to repay down, and on average, they managed to achieve about 25 to 30% of that. So a lot of us will sort of make the mistake of overestimating how quickly and how effectively we'll be able to pay our way out of debt, and we need to be a little bit more realistic. It's a little bit like dieting. You go on a diet, you don't see the results on the scales, it becomes extremely demotivating, and then you sort of fall off the bandwagon. So it's about being really realistic and knowing yourself well enough that you can come up with an effective plan.
Yeah, definitely. And what are some of more of those psychological factors that come into play that impact people during challenging times and during times where it is important to manage their finances better, I guess?
Well, I would say it's important to manage your finances actually during the good times. One of the problems is it takes so long to get yourself out of a debt situation that if you go into a period like we've got now, which has really occurred quite quickly in terms of rising mortgage rates, inflation, all of that's come about in the space of 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah.
Given it can take you a couple of years to get yourself out of a debt situation, it's almost more important that you sort of prevent yourself from getting there in the first place. But there are definitely some psychological factors that influence our decision making. And there's quite a range of them that's talked about in the literature. Things like, are you an impulsive person? Impulsive people are more likely to spend.
Yeah.
Are you an emotional spender? Do you have a bad day and go online and do some shopping to make yourself feel better? Are you a materialistic person? And I'm sure we all know that person who's got to have this year's iPhone, or the latest and greatest in gadgets. Again, those sorts of people are more likely to be carrying debt because that's an expensive way to live life. And unless you've got a large income to support it, they're probably doing it on debt. One of the other big factors is, and it sort of plays in with the idea of whether you're a spender or a saver, is what we call time orientation. Are you someone who lives for today, or are you able to delay gratification for the future? And the reality is we know that most people are short-term orientated. We don't like the idea of waiting. We're impatient people. But yeah, all of those things go into how we make financial decisions and ultimately influence things like how much debt we carry and how much debt we use.
Yeah. And in terms of like the long-term consequences of not addressing debt effectively, what can that look like, and what kind of, hardships can that put upon a person during, difficult times?
There's actually a really wide range of consequences from carrying a lot of debt and being what we call over-indebted. So over-indebted is that situation where we're actually in a situation where our debt is starting to really impact on us.
Yeah.
We're struggling to make repayments. There's the obvious ones, right? If we are over-indebted, we're going to be stressed, we're going to be anxious. And that's been shown to affect even our work productivity. But it's the less obvious ones that are also a little bit concerning, because if we're stressed and anxious, that actually has really negative consequences on our health. So mental illness, depression, suicide ideation. There have even been suggestions that it plays out in chronic illness. So that financial anxiety and stress can really manifest in some quite serious ways. And then, of course, if you get into the situation where you wind up defaulting on debt, then there's all the long-term financial consequences that come from that. So being late on repayments, that has a negative impact on your credit score. Your credit score influences your ability to access things like reasonable cost debt. So this is one of the tricky things with buy now, pay later, because it's not covered by consumer finance laws the way that most other debt is. I think Australia's moved more quickly than most towards actually bringing it in under that umbrella, but certainly in New Zealand it's still not. It makes it affordable to people who have gotten themselves locked out of affordable debt, and for whom the only other option would be things like loan sharks and payday lenders. So your car breaks down, you need your car for work, you need to get it fixed. You may not have a choice about using debt. But if you've got bad credit, then the cheaper, more socially acceptable, the more regulated elements of the financial system become off limits to you. And that makes life harder. And we know that people who are declared bankrupt can sometimes wind up in a state that we call unbanked. So banks won't actually open bank accounts for people who have been bankrupted. And one of the consequences of COVID is that it is increasingly becoming hard to operate in our society without an EFTPOS card or a debit card, because places aren't taking cash the way that they used to. I wouldn't even want to try going to my employer and asking to have my wages paid to me in cash. So that financial exclusion is actually has some really serious consequences.
Yeah. And can we, do you think, negotiate with creditors or lenders to restructure debt in a way that's more manageable during times of distress or hardship?
Yep, we certainly can. As I said earlier, prevention is the best cure in this particular case. So trying to avoid getting yourself into that particular situation. I mean, there are a lot of strategies that we can use once we have gotten ourselves into financial situations to try and make our situation more manageable. I think one of the things I'd really stress here is the need to be proactive. Once you realize that you're starting to get into a situation where things are starting to get hard, there is a tendency for some people to sort of bury their head in the sand and try and ignore the problem and hope that it will go away.
Yeah.
But really, you're better to front foot it and actually start to talk to financial organizations. If you've got a mortgage, and we know that a lot of people are struggling with mortgages these days because of the really rapid increase in the interest rates and the size of mortgages that people are carrying these days. One of the options you have is to go to the bank and see whether you can actually switch to what we call an interest-only mortgage. Now, interest-only mortgages aren't great products because you are not actually paying down the debt. And it's by paying down the debt that you reduce the interest over the longer term. But if that's what you need to get you through a hump, and we do expect that interest rates will start to come back at some time in the next couple of years, if that's what you need to do to be able to hold on to that home and the value of an asset that you've built up in that, then it's worth going and having the conversation with the bank early. Banks don't like to foreclose on properties. They try to avoid it, and they will be reasonable about working with people. If you're carrying a lot of consumer debt, there are some other options you have as long as you haven't gotten to the situation where your credit rating is quite bad. For instance, debt consolidation loans. So a debt consolidation loan is often cheaper than things like hire purchases and credit cards. It also makes managing the situation easier because you have one debt rather than lots of debts. So you can go to a debt consolidation lender, borrow at a lower interest rate, which then makes the debt more affordable. One of the a strategy for credit cards even is to use what they call balance transfer credit cards. So that's a situation where by switching provider, they might give you a 6-month period where you have a very low interest rate. Now, you don't want to spend on that credit card, and you certainly want to cut up the old credit card so that you don't have the temptation to dig the hole even deeper.
Yeah.
But if you've got no interest on it and you can pay most of what you were paying beforehand, then you can make a real big dent in that credit card quite quickly, and far more so than you would if you were paying 25% on your credit card. So there are those strategies, but you need to be proactive, and you need to front foot it. In terms of actually negotiating with lenders, sometimes it's actually better to go to some of the organisations that are around who can help you to do that. So in New Zealand, we have organisations like Good Shepherd and Christians Against Poverty and these sorts of organisations who will provide budget advice, support, and who have that expertise in negotiating directly with some of the lenders about making things slightly more affordable. And that can be more effective than trying to do it yourself, because sometimes the organisations may not necessarily want to buy into it.
Yeah. And before you mentioned this term loan shark or shark loan?
Loan shark.
Loan shark, yeah. Could you please tell us a bit more about that and what they are or it is?
So loan shark tends to be sort of jargon that we use for what we call third-tier lenders. So if your banks are your first tiers and your sort of consumer finance organisations are sort of your second tier, your third tier are the sort of people who lend to people who are extremely risky. And they have extremely high interest rates. So in New Zealand, I think the interest rate is capped that they can charge people, but we're talking effective interest rates of over 100% per year.
Oh, wow.
So extremely high. They are really lenders of last resort. And most people, especially if you live in a more affluent area, will probably never see them because they do tend to cluster themselves in socially deprived areas and they tend to prey on the less well off. They are unfortunately, I guess, a bit of a necessary evil, because like I said, sometimes they can be the only lenders for people who have gotten themselves into difficulties, who need to borrow but are shut out from the more reputable lenders.
Yeah. And what if you're in a situation where you have been shut out from the more reputable lenders, but you don't want to go to this third party? What do you do in those situations when you're kind of stuck?
That's a tough one, because your options are going to be a lot more limited if you're shut out from those reputable lenders.
Yeah.
There are increasingly organisations that will do, in New Zealand, like I said, Good Loans Good Shepherd has combined with, I think it's BNZ, and they do a product called Good Loans, and these are loans for people who absolutely have to borrow, but who are not necessarily able to access the mainstream. But you're going to need to show that it is actually an emergency situation, and it's not as easy as getting credit from, say, a buy now later provider or somebody like that.
Yeah. And when we're talking about these dire situations, I think the idea of like financial well-being comes up. So how can we sort of tap into financial well-being? Are there any strategies we can use to optimize debt, reduce burden?
Well, I guess financial well-being is the end outcome. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth defining financial well-being.
Yeah.
It isn't a term that has actually got a singular definition, but it's generally made up of sort of three concepts. Are you able to meet your financial commitments, your necessary financial commitments? So can you pay your utilities? Can you pay for your rent or your mortgage? Can you cover any debt that you've got? Are you financially comfortable? So getting to a situation where your financial situation is no longer a source of concern and anxiety and stress for you. And are you financially resilient? And so that means that when the wheels fall off for whatever reason, car breaks down, you need to change a washing machine or a fridge or whatever, can you cover that without having to go into a debt situation? Can you do it without compromising your financial position? So that's the end goal. That's what we're all trying to work towards, is getting people so that they have strong financial well-being. Debt, for the most part, is actually something that compromises our financial well-being. It increases our commitments, those those repayments that we need to make. And what that does is it makes us less capable of dealing with shocks. So we saw it during COVID. Let's hope COVID never comes back. But we saw it during COVID where people had to take, were either furloughed, were basically had no income for a period, or where they had to take pay cuts. If you're carrying debt, you're less capable of rolling with those punches because the minimum amount of income that you need is much higher. Because debt is a necessary repayment. It doesn't change depending on our income. So it makes it harder for us to meet our commitments. It also makes us less financially resilient because when those shocks happen, we're less capable of sort of rolling with the punches. The exceptions to that are those sorts of good debts. So buying a house on a mortgage. We know that we're not going to be able to buy a house without a mortgage. We need a mortgage. And buying a house is going to build our financial well-being and our financial resources and make us more secure and resilient. So some of those debts, those good debts, are actually beneficial towards our financial well-being. But even there, I would say what you need is to understand how the product works and how to minimize the cost of the product. Most people don't realize it, but for instance, your average mortgage over a 30-year period, if you're simply making the repayments, take the cost of the mortgage and double it. So it's going to cost you twice what the initial value was. And that extra mortgage, again, is just interest. That's what the banks are making out of the deal.
Yeah.
If you can understand how to work the system, then you can reduce that cost quite significantly, which is obviously going to make you better off in the long run.
Yeah. And I would love to dive into our practices and habits section and sort of just continue on from what we've been talking about and talk more strategies. So is there a specific strategy you would recommend, example, for understanding the system or working the system or reducing debt in general?
I guess there it's about acquiring that financial knowledge.
Yeah.
And I don't think you need to acquire all of the financial knowledge in one big go, right? If you're 21 years old, figuring out how a mortgage works isn't going to benefit you today. But as we start to experience these things, I think it's really important that we actually take the time to read up about them, to understand what it is that we're signing. Most of us know roughly what a mortgage is. But for instance, there can be some really big differences in the way that mortgages operate between different providers around things like voluntary repayments. So the situation in New Zealand, two of our banks, for instance, one of them allows you to pay off an extra 5% on a fixed rate mortgage per year. And you can do that as a lump sum, or you can do that per week. You can basically do it however you like.
Yeah.
One of the other banks, one of the Australian banks, what they say is if you want to pay off extra, then you need to do it fortnightly, and you need to make those extra repayments the same amounts for the entire rest of the time that fixed rate component goes. Now, that's a lot less friendly, because if I want to pay off an extra $200 a fortnight, then I need to be 100% certain that I can pay off that extra for the next 2 years. Yeah. And most of us don't necessarily have that certainty because things happen. So it's really about knowing the details. And it's really unfortunate because the documentation that comes around these things is not really designed for people to understand. But that's kind of what you need to do is spend the time and understand what the product is.
Yeah. And in terms of where people start with this, where do they start? Like, how do they start acquiring this knowledge? Would you recommend academic resources? Would you recommend starting with a budgeting app, or where would you go to begin?
I certainly wouldn't recommend academic sources. Most of the academic sources are written for academic audiences, so a lot of what's in there is probably neither useful nor necessarily understandable.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, academics, like finance people, love our jargon. But I think there are a lot of really good resources out there that you can sort of tap into. And I think personal finance is one of those topics that there's a lot of sort of mainstream resources, Barefoot Investor. There's a lot of those sorts of resources that are out there where you can go and read blogs, things like that, where people will break these products down and will actually start to talk to you about the bits that you need to really think about and consider. So I think that's a really good place to start. I think the other thing to do is not be afraid to actually ask questions.
Yeah.
And go out there and find people who can give you the information that you need. Now, it's really critical to remember where people's incentives lie.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of the advice that you might get if you go to your bank, for instance, is perhaps not necessarily going to be as independent as we would like it to be. So sometimes it's also about remembering what the biases are in the information that you're getting, so that you can sort of figure out what is self-interest and what is actually in your best interest.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting you bring up asking questions, because there is so much jargon surrounding this, and there are so many terms and, things that are being thrown out there, and people often are like, okay, if I don't understand it, I'm just not going to even try understand it, or I'll leave it for the people who do understand it. And I feel like that's where, taking that responsibility and learning how to educate yourself and gain that knowledge is important. So when we do have that knowledge, when we do ask those questions, how do you think that improves our resilience in moments of hardship or economic distress?
Well, I think it gives you a stronger basis for your decision making.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand, just because we're financially literate or financially capable doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Our superannuation scheme in New Zealand, KiwiSaver, I got burnt a couple of years ago quite badly by going with the wrong provider. Now, I had good reasons for doing it, but they wound up being absolutely bottom of the performance ranking and cost me quite a bit of money. So even I, as a finance professor, will make mistakes.
Yeah.
But it's about coming at it from that informed position and feeling a bit more confident about our decisions when we're making them. I think the other thing is, if we are more informed, then we are perhaps a little more capable of seeing through some of the information that we're provided.
Yeah.
So coming back to the buy now, pay later example, where the buy now, pay later providers are advertising themselves in a way that I don't think is necessarily 100% accurate. It's legal. Don't know that they're necessarily, or they were necessarily giving the full story. Yeah. If you're coming from a more educated place, then you can actually see through some of that a bit better and are less likely to buy into some of the stuff that might get you into trouble later on. So I personally think that having some knowledge is critical. I also think you need to be careful of the old adage that a little knowledge can be dangerous. So not getting too confident in your knowledge, but always looking for new information, double checking what you know, those sorts of things I think are really critical.
Yeah, certainly. And you said that you've recently started looking into buy now and pay later. Would you be able to talk to us a bit more about that and what you found and what's piqued your interest in it?
What piqued my interest in buy now, pay later is that, to me, it is set up as a product that just screamed danger signs to me. Yeah. It is a product that was targeted at originally millennials and Gen Zs, young adults who don't necessarily have a huge amount of financial experience behind them yet. It's a product that was designed to be quick and easy. In fact, we had one respondent to a survey that we did who said that they often used their buy now, pay later because they couldn't be bothered to go and find their wallet and get their debit card. I mean, when you've got a product where people are using it like that, you know that there's a bit of an issue.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about buy now, pay later is it is just so much more pervasive than most of the other forms of debt that we've had. So in many respects, it's a little bit like a hire purchase, but hire purchases have typically been for higher value sort of products. You know, you buy a laptop or a fridge or a couch or something like that, not $120 top or a pair of shoes or stuff like that. Yeah. And so all of a sudden you had this product that was almost mainstreaming debt in a way that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah.
But it does have some benefits. And one of them is that it is available to people who might be shut out of the financial system. I don't think it's the right solution for that problem, but it does offer that opportunity for people. And if you're smart and savvy, it's not a bad product because you're essentially using someone else's money while yours sits in the bank and earns you interest. I think you have to be the right sort of person to be able to use it that way. But it is certainly has some benefits. And so we actually started out looking at asking the question of what is the implications of buy now, pay later on over-indebtedness? And is this actually creating a problem? The other thing about buy now, pay later is that it is relatively small amounts. So, for instance, Afterpay caps out at $2,000. Is $2,000 going to break somebody's financial situation? On its own, possibly not. If they've got Afterpay, Lay-By, Klarna, Zip, if they've actually got 5 or 6 of these different products, that's a different situation. And because they're not talking to the credit rating agencies and stuff like that, it can be people who are getting themselves, being allowed to dig themselves into a financial hole much more easily than they could in using other debt products. So that's why we set out to have a look at it. And what we found was that, yes, it is contributing to over-indebtedness, particularly in young adults who are the least capable of dealing with this particular product. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the experience, and they don't have the level of income and stability to be able to support using it the way that, unfortunately, some people are.
Yeah. And I feel like it's really interesting how you brought up that some people are using buy now, pay later for small items like $150 top, for example. And I've got a lot of friends who see it as a really great asset. Like they can put $200 on buy now, pay later, and they see that as a win. And they're like, great, I don't have to spend that money. Like I've got that money, but I don't have to spend it now. And I can just pay it over time, even though I have that money and I have the capacity to pay for it. I just don't want to.
And for a person who's got the money sitting in the bank, that's not necessarily a bad way of doing it. The problem comes when you've got people who don't necessarily have the money sitting in the bank today and aren't sure that they will in the future.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I mean, we're going through a cost of living crisis at the moment. And in New Zealand, at least, there have been reports about people using buy now, pay later for things like groceries. And that's a really concerning trend because you should not be putting food on debt. And the fact that people are feeling that is an appropriate way, or, well, putting aside the fact that it's unfortunate that people feel the need to do that in the first place. I think that's a critical issue all by itself. But using debt for something that it literally leaves no trace, that is not building your net worth in any way, that's really dangerous. And that creates debt spirals that are how people really get into big trouble and wind up with those really negative consequences from being over indebted.
Yeah. And do you think that people are using buy now, pay later too liberally, like how we mentioned before?
It may have been as high as a third of people are basically constantly repaying buy now, pay later. So they're using it at least monthly. And given that it usually takes about 6 weeks to pay off buy now, pay later, that means that they're constantly got at least one, maybe more of these things going.
Yeah.
Because it is so easy, because it is so available, it does create that situation where people start to see it as being quite normal. And it can create a situation, well, and psychologically, as we mentioned earlier, There's been some research that comes out that sort of suggests that people aren't mentally accounting for it in the same way that you would a normal transaction, because it's not $100, it's $25 today, because I've only got to pay 25%. And if I'm not thinking about the other 75% that I have to pay off in the future, and I'm not doing the math and planning for it, that's how people are getting themselves into trouble.
Yeah.
It's worth remembering that the buy now, pay later providers themselves, and this is kind of ironic, have a big problem with bad debt.
Interesting.
They're carrying a lot of bad debt, which suggests that there are a lot of people who are not using it well. And even if, and before Afterpay was acquired by Block, you could have a look in the annual reports and see how much of their income was actually coming from late fees. And it was quite high. So, I mean, that suggests that a lot of people are unfortunately not using it as wisely as it can be used. And that's costly.
Yeah. And you mentioned this idea of, buy now, pay later being easy and normal. And it got me to think about how you can now add, like, for example, Afterpay into your Apple Wallet, and it's as simple as tapping at a store like you would with a debit card, for instance. So they have been very, very smart and clever in how they've designed these products. They have made it ridiculously convenient. Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why we've seen this significant uptake in these particular products, because I can literally go online, download the app, takes a minute or two to get verified, and then I can start spending. It's much harder to get a credit card. It is much harder to get higher purchases and stuff like that. So, it's a very simple process. And that unfortunately makes it too convenient.
Yeah, definitely. And if you could leave people with one piece of advice, what would that be?
Use debt smart. Debt is a tool. Debt is like any tool. You can use it well or you can use it poorly. I'm not adverse to people using debt as long as they are using it to build financial wealth, that they're understanding it well enough that they can minimize the cost, and so that they're making it work for them rather than the other way around.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Aaron, for coming on the show and chatting to us and giving us some more insight and knowledge into a topic that a lot of people don't know enough about. So you've really opened up a door there to encourage more knowledge, to encourage more, capability surrounding finance. So that's really great. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Perfect. And if people want to find out a bit more about you, where can they go?
If you Google Aaron Gilbert and AUT, you'll get my bio, which has got links to a lot of my research.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time. You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.